So I really think, I'm speaking slightly sort of foolishly, but I think that the real key that Elon needs to think is, how is he going to use his technology to make someone more attractive, or make someone more popular on social media, or make some because I think then people will start queuing up to use it. But to be honest, to just use this thing to summon my Tesla by thinking rather than getting out my mobile phone to do it, I'm not going to be at the front of the queue for that brain surgery, I'm afraid.
What's up, you scholars of enlightenment? So last Friday, tech entrepreneur Elon Musk revealed his latest moonshoot project, the Neuralink. Now, Neuralink is a chip installed into the brain of an animal that can record and wirelessly relay brain activity.
This is a high energy pig. All right, Gertrude, thanks for coming out. So what the beeps you're hearing are real-time signals from the Neuralink in Gertrude's head. So this Neuralink connects to neurons that are in her snout. So whenever she snuffles around and touches something with her snout, that sends out neural spikes, which are detected here.
And Musk says that one day this will help us to create cognitively enhanced humans, wireless human-to-machine interfaces, and maybe help the handicapped to walk. So these are pretty bold claims, very big statements. So to help us dig through the promises, the pitfalls, and the neuroscience of these claims, we welcome Professor Andrew Jackson to the channel. Professor Jackson, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for taking the time. We very much appreciate it. So Professor Jackson is a professor of neural interfaces at Newcastle University here in the UK. And his current work involves developing a neural prosthesis to restore hand function following spinal cord injury and stroke, and also the CANDO project, controlling abnormal network dynamics using optogenetics, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but we got there. A multi-site interdisciplinary project to develop a cortical implant for optogenetic neural control of seizures. So very important, very cutting edge research. And who better to guide us through these sci-fi sounding waters? So just before we get into discussing this, Professor, on last Friday night, this demo occurred involving a pig called Gertrude, fitted with what tech tycoon Elon Musk described as a Fitbit for your skull, this Neuralink. It's a tiny device recording the animal's neural activity, and we saw impulses from the brain being sent wirelessly to a screen. We got a series of beeps and bloops, which happened every time the snout of the pig touched something, indicating that a part of the brain was seeking out food or was trying to put instructions related to food. And Musk said that this was incredibly profound. So Neuralink is this hugely ambitious plan to link the human brain to a computer and animal brains to computers. And it might eventually allow people with conditions like Parkinson's disease to control their physical movements or manipulate machines through the power of thought. So first question, before we sort of get into Neuralink specifically and what it represents or not, I want to understand exactly what we're trying to achieve or demonstrate here with this demonstration by Musk, because Musk seems to be suggesting that the Neuralink project is a plan to link the human brain to a computer, and it might help get over all these conditions like Parkinson's disease. How would that work? How do these sort of machines work that link the human brain to machines or prostheses?
Elon Musk is doing is he's trying to build a brain-machine interface. And brain-machine interfaces work using small wires called electrodes, and they sit next to brain cells, and they listen to bits flowing around brain circuits. And if we can listen to those bits and we can understand what they're encoding, then it's possible to infer to some extent what the brain is trying to do.
Yeah.
And now this builds on many decades of research with animals that have shown that, for example, when you make a movement of your arm, either to the left or the right, there may be some brain cells that prefer a movement to the left, some brain cells that prefer a movement to the right. And you can sort of, if you know what those brain cells prefer, you can count up their action potentials, their spikes, a little bit like counting up votes in an election.
Yep. And
you can decode from the brain whether the animal is trying to make a movement to the left or the right.
See, probably see that. As I was saying, each of those dots represents a neural spike, and the blue chart at the bottom is showing an accumulation of neural spikes in that region.
So this was really done for the first time at scale earlier in this century in monkeys by people like Professor Miguel Nicolelis.
And that's exactly what we did 10 years ago. We started with a superstar monkey called Aurora that became one of the superstars of this field. And Aurora liked to play video games. As you can see here, she likes to use a joystick like any one of us, any of our kids, to play this game. And as a good primate, she even tries to cheat before she gets the right answer. So even before a target appears that she's supposed to cross with the cursor that she's controlling with this joystick, Aurora is trying to find the target, no matter where it is. And she's doing that because every time she crosses that target with the little cursor, she gets a drop of Brazilian orange juice. And I can tell you, any monkey will do anything for you if you get the little drop of Brazilian orange juice. Actually, any primate will do that. Think about that. Well, while Aurora was playing this game, as you saw, and doing, 1,000 trials a day and getting 97% correct and 350 mLs of orange juice, we were recording the brainstorms that were produced in her head and sending to a robotic arm that was learning to reproduce the movements that Aurora was making. Because the idea was to actually turn on this brain-machine interface and have Aurora play the game just by thinking, without the interference of her body. Her brainstorms would control an arm that would move the cursor and cross the target. And to our shock, that's exactly what Aurora did. She played the game without moving her body. So every trajectory that you see the cursor now, this is the exact first moment she got that. That's the exact first moment a brain intention was liberated from the physical domains of a body of a primate and could act outside, in that outside world, just by controlling an artificial device.
And Andy Schwartz. And then a team led by John Donoghue, called the BrainGate team, was actually the first to show that you could do this in a person. So they began implanting arrays of about 100 electrodes into the brains of people who had been paralyzed by things like spinal cord injuries and motor neuron disease. And they showed that by using this technique, they could help people to, say, move a cursor around on a computer screen, move a prosthetic arm.
In this paper, 2 people with tetraplegia, that is 2 people who were unable to move their arms or their legs in any functionally useful way, were able to control a prosthetic or a robotic arm simply by thinking about the movement of their own paralyzed hand. And they did that using the investigational BrainGate neural interface system. So they thought about using their own arm and hand as though they were reaching out themselves with their own limb, and the robotic arm moved much the way their own arm would have moved.
It is possible for people to use their thoughts to control devices, either a computer or a robotic arm. And the way that happens is that we implant a tiny sensor, just about the size of a baby aspirin, just into the surface of the brain, and that sensor pick up the electrical impulses from a bunch of neurons. And each of those little neurons are like radio broadcast towers putting out impulses. And when they get to the outside, a computer translator converts the pattern of pulses into something that is a command.
What the Neuralink team is doing is trying to kind of push the technology there. They are moving away from devices that need cables coming through the skin.
And she's had the implant for 2 months. So this is a healthy and happy pig with an implant that is 2 months old and working well. Yeah. And we've been able to show that you can actually have multiple neural links implanted and again, healthy and happy and indistinguishable from a normal pig. This is our little device. That thing at the bottom is just to hold the threads in place because they're just like little fine wires. So in terms of getting a link, like I said, it's essentially you open a piece of skull, you remove about a coin-sized piece of skull, and then the robot inserts the electrodes. We'll talk more about that later. Then the device replaces the portion of skull that was removed, and we basically close that up with actually super glue, which is how a lot of wounds are closed, and then you can just walk around right afterwards. It's pretty cool.
Gone from 100 channels that are conventionally used in the demonstrations to date to 1,000 channels, and with time we can hopefully push that further. They've also demonstrated a very nice surgical robot for implanting all of these 100 electrodes into the brain.
And we actually ultimately want this robot to do essentially the entire surgery. So in everything from incision, removing the skull, inserting the electrodes. And we feel confident about getting the link procedure, the installation of a link, done in under an hour. So you can basically go in the morning and leave the hospital in the afternoon.
And I think this is all an important part of turning the technology from a sort of proof of principle to something that maybe is more usable and could be more widely used by people with disabilities.
So just to sort of streamline that, or to make sure my understanding is correct. So we have these implants in the brain, these electrodes, they collect these action potentials. They relay that to a computer which decodes what the brain is attempting to say or has an attempt to try to do that. And then is that information sent to a receptor or a machine to then give some sort of action, some sort of output, as we see with someone moving a prosthesis or someone controlling a machine with their mind?
So the Neuralink team didn't demonstrate that, but they demonstrated the types of things that might be done. So, for example, they showed that they could listen to the activity from the pig's brain and use that to predict where the pig's legs were on a treadmill.
So, in terms of additional brain reading activity, when we have, say, one of our pigs on a treadmill, pig on a treadmill. It's a funny concept, really. And we take the readings from the neurons, and we try to predict the position of the joints. And so we say we have the predicted position of the joints, and then we measure the actual position of the joints. You can see that they're almost exactly aligned. So we're able, with a wireless neural implant, to actually predict the position of all of the limbs in the pig's body with very high accuracy.
Now, you could imagine that you could use that information to perhaps drive an orthosis, to move a paralyzed leg accordingly. I think what they're probably most interested in is using what they call the read-write functionality of their device. So as well as being able to listen to the electrical signals from these electrodes, they're also able to deliver electrical stimulation back to these electrodes. Now, you could imagine that if you put some of these electrodes not in the brain but in the spinal cord, then you could use this to provide a bridge across an injured spinal cord and send the signals into the spinal cord and generate movements of the paralyzed limb. And indeed, I, amongst others, have shown that this is possible in principle. I mean, in about 2014, we showed that you could take brain signals from the motor parts of the brain in a monkey that we had temporarily paralyzed with a drug, take those signals and use them to control electrical stimulation sent into the spinal cord, and we restored a pretty simple movement of grasping. Another scientist, Grégoire Courtine, has done something similar with leg movements in monkeys a few years ago. Again, the Neuralink technology is at least another order of magnitude of more powerful technology, and so could be used potentially to restore more complex movements of the limbs in people with paralysis.
So what is the state of the art in this field? Because for the last sort of 10 to 15 years or so, I've been seeing videos pop up every now and again of particularly monkeys, which I guess because they're more related to humans, so the brain activity is as close as we can get. And some humans as well, with this Bloomberg video, which I'll show to the people watching. Seemingly of those animals and humans capable of moving prosthetic or robot arms with their mind and some electrodes wired into their brain.
Hold it, and relax.
Johnny Matheny has become something of a guinea pig for experimental prosthetics.
Hand open.
What he's testing here being the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, is a glimpse into the future of how humans and machines interact. It's a mind-controlled arm that attaches directly to his skeleton. And it's the result of a decade of work and $120 million of military funding.
So this is the first time that we're attaching a prosthetic device to an implant that protrudes out of his skin and allows the prosthesis to actually be physically attached to his skeleton.
Okay, elbow extend, elbow in.
So how far along are we with that sort of technology? Because is the problem there that at the moment we've got just out of shot some huge machine that's doing the decoding and relaying the information? What's the sort of state of the art there as regards rolling this out to any sort of practical application?
So, as I say, a lot of the early demonstrations were in monkeys. That's partly because a lot of the early work focused on the upper limb, and actually movement to the upper limb is a real priority for people who are paralyzed. When you think of the ways that you use your upper limb all the time in daily life. Monkeys and other primates are really the only creatures that use their upper limbs the same way that humans do and have the same kind of neuroanatomy. What I think is quite impressive is that we moved quite quickly from demonstrations in monkeys to demonstrations in humans. So in each case, there was about a 4-year lag between a demonstration like moving a computer cursor in a monkey and then the same thing being demonstrated in a human. And probably the state of the art at the moment would be the use of brain signals in people who are paralyzed to control electrical stimulation of the muscles, which has been able to restore fairly simple movements, but useful movements to people who are paralyzed. Where the field is going, I think one direction is thinking about restoring speech. And that's something that obviously a monkey is not a very useful experimental model. But there are now more and more situations where electrodes are at least temporarily being put into human brains, and people are starting to understand how brain signals relate to at least the movement of mouth muscles being used to produce speech. So there are some quite impressive demonstrations coming out of being able to decode speech from the brain, and I think that could again be a useful avenue for some people who have difficulties producing speech.
Imagine you're paralyzed and can't move or speak. How would you communicate with the world? Assistive devices can enable people with paralysis to type sentences letter by letter at up to 10 words per minute. But that's a far cry from everyday conversations, which take place at about 150 words per minute. New research from UC San Francisco shows it's possible to generate synthesized speech directly from brain signals. Speech is complex. Brain signals precisely coordinate nearly 100 muscles to move the lips, jaw, tongue, and larynx, shaping our breath into sounds that form our words and sentences. In the UCSF study, volunteer participants being treated for epilepsy read sentences aloud while electrodes placed on the surface of their brains measured the resulting signals.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
A computational model based on that data enabled the researchers to decode how activity patterns in the brain's speech centers contribute to particular movements of the vocal tract. These simulated vocal tract movements were transformed into sounds to generate intelligible, synthesized speech.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
compare that to the participant's actual speaking voice.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Now the synthesized speech again.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
The sound patterns of the individual words synthesized from brain activity are remarkably similar to the original spoken sentences.
And equally, there's a lot of work going on in terms of restoring some simple sensory functions. If we could perhaps electrically stimulate the visual areas of the brain, controlled perhaps by a camera that is analyzing the scene, then it might be possible to restore probably fairly basic visual abilities, but perhaps the abilities to see flashes of light, and that these would be things that would be useful to people who have severe disabilities that maybe don't have many other ways of kind of getting those kind of functions back.
Yeah. So what is the big problem with getting the technology rolled out to this sort of sci-fi level that people want to see, of, you know, people who are handicapped being able to walk, you know, people who can't see being able to see? Is it that difficulty of decoding exactly what the brain is trying to tell us? I imagine it's very noisy when you have more complicated actions. You have different parts of the brain that want to say different things, that compete and such. Is that the major stumbling block towards getting towards perhaps some of the more fanciful ideas that Musk was leaning on last week?
So I think it's important to separate the technological hurdles from perhaps the scientific hurdles. So the technological hurdles are things like, if you want to record a lot of brain cells, these brain cells, the signals involve a lot of data, and so up till now, most of the efforts to do this have involved sending that data down a wire. Yeah. If you want to send that data wirelessly, it takes a lot of power, and if you're going to power that from something that's implanted in the skin, you need under the skin, you need that to be small enough, and the battery to be small enough. And what they're doing, I mean, one advance they're making, and this is I think a sensible approach, it's something that I've also sort of worked on in the past, is putting circuitry in the implant that detects just the bit of the signal that you're interested in, which in this case is these action potentials, these spikes. And by detecting that at source, you can compress down the amount of data that you need to send out of the implant. And that helps with power consumption and so forth. And so they're progressing very nicely with these kind of questions. And I think that these are the things that you would expect a tech company to be good at, right? Yeah. And these are the things that you would expect that you'll get fairly quick returns from putting in the kind of resources and the kind of smart electrical engineers and so forth that are working on this. I think that I feel that the challenges aren't just technological, though. So we tend to assume in the field that if we can just record more neurons, more brain cells, if we just keep increasing the numbers and hopefully, increase the numbers on a kind of exponential Moore's law kind of curve, that all other problems will fall by the wayside.
Well, once we get all the information, it'll be easy to see what's going on, essentially.
Yeah. But I'm not sure that necessarily that's true. And I think my example of this might be that actually in terms of understanding how the brain works, we've gone from a lot of work where we recorded from one neuron at a time. When these techniques first came in, we looked at one neuron at a time in the 1950s and 60s. When I started doing my PhD, I was recording in the 90s. I was recording from a sort of fairly state-of-the-art 16-channel device. Then we went to 100 channels in the early 2000s, and now perhaps what one could think of a competitor to Elon Musk's technology is a thing called the Neuropixels probe, which has hundreds of these recording sites packed onto a tiny kind of millimeter piece of silicon, right? And we could envisage putting several of these in maybe 100 of these in the brain, and you're up to sort of 10,000, 100,000 neurons. Actually, over that time, unfortunately, our scientific understanding of the brain hasn't sort of advanced anything like as quickly as the technology has advanced. And in terms of the sort of concepts that we're working on about how we sort of think about how the brain works, we're using concepts that really were articulated back in the 1960s when people were recording one cell at a time. And so I think we need to be kind of somewhat kind of modest about how much we really understand the brain. Now, to me, it's an interesting question whether we need to understand at a scientific level the brain in order for this brain-machine interface technology to progress, right? And I'll give you a kind of example of one thing that I think is useful when thinking about this. Back in maybe the 1970s, we had very basic speech recognition software. And you would have to talk to this software for many hours to get it to train up on your voice. And then you would have to speak very slowly, and still the software would get sort of 2/3 of the words wrong. And I think you could say that that's where we're at with brain-machine interfaces now. And at the time, in the 1970s, there were lots of kind of linguists who said that the way we're going to get better at this is we're going to have a scientific understanding of language. And you should sort of fund people like me to go off and sit in universities and understand the principles of language better. Now, in hindsight, they were kind of wrong. So nowadays, Amazon will sell you for, I don't know, $20 a bit of plastic that you can put on your mantelpiece, and anyone can walk in and say, order me more toilet paper, and it will understand that, and it will go off and do it. And I probably will upset some linguists when I say this, but it wasn't the linguists who got us from the bad speech recognition software to the good speech recognition. It was artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence came along and took a big data set of different people talking and labels saying this is what they're saying, and we put it all in, and now speech recognition works, and we still don't really understand language any better than we did in the 1960s.
It's sort of the black box of machine learning, isn't it? We don't necessarily understand how it worked it out, but it's worked out the necessary patterns to be able to have a productive output that we can use in an application.
Exactly, and it's entirely possible. I find it a bit depressing as a neuroscientist, but it's entirely possible we may, in another few, I don't know, decades, have brain-machine interfaces that are understanding what we're thinking, while we as scientists still don't know how the brain works. However, I would add a sort of cautionary note to that, which is that language has been sort of designed by evolution to be a communication mechanism, right? So there's a reason why there's information and structure in speech that is communicating what the person is meaning. When it comes to brain signals and what brain signals are trying to do and how they're trying to do it, they certainly were never meant to be understood by external devices. Their job, if it even makes sense to say what the job of a brain cell is to do, is to be part of a network that's doing some kind of computational processing that somehow ends up with us generating intelligent behavior. And I think that to try to apply the speech decoding kind of logic to the brain, one would have to think that we're going to have to sit there thinking lots of thoughts whilst at the same time telling someone what we're thinking and then building up some kind of mapping. And I don't really know how many thoughts I would have to think, sort of individual thoughts, to build that decoder. And then would the way that my brain is thinking about things be in any way the same as the way your brain is thinking about things? So would a single kind of decoder be able to be either plugged into my brain and plugged, a thought for me is such a personal thing that links in with so many individual bits of my own experience. So those will be very different from what that same thought means to you. And so I think it's not impossible, but it's slightly naive, I think, to think that we can just expect artificial intelligence to come in and solve these problems for us.
So it's a sort of, there's a little bit of friction between the academics who want to understand something more from a first principles, I guess, would be a way to explain it. Idea of what the brain is doing, why it's doing it, how it evolved to do it, what the purpose of it was. And then the technologists who are just sort of saying, well, we can look at the signals and we know that the person was trying to find some food, or the pig was trying to find some food when they were doing that. So those signals mean find food, and go forward without really understanding the underlying mechanisms or the structures of the brain that sort of lead into that. So it's I think
it's important to try, right? I mean, so it's important to try these approaches,
yeah.
And whether they succeed or they fail, they will provide us with information, right? It will help us to understand some of the answers to these questions.
Yeah.
But I think that, like I say, there may be kind of fundamental scientific hurdles that can't just be solved by making devices smaller, increasing the channel count, and all of the kind of electrical engineering push that is being done. Of course, the two go together, right? So by building these better devices, it allows us to do more sophisticated experiments. And so it's not, this is in no way a kind of any kind of competition between sort of science and engineering, which it sometimes gets made out to be. It's just to say that we can't take the science for granted.
Yeah, and I think that leads nicely into, because this, I think your thoughts on this, which you've now made very clear to me now, were sort of taken out of context a little bit by Elon Musk, who didn't really understand that you were saying, look, both of these sides of the coin need to be brought together. So you made this very clear. You were saying that, look, this is really good engineering. It's in situ on the brain. It's getting these signals out wirelessly, which is a great improvement. But it's not necessarily talking about how we're going to decode that information and the fundamental science. And Elon wasn't very happy about this. He said that it is unfortunately common for many in academia to overweight the value of ideas and underweight the bringing of them to fruition. For example, the idea of going to the moon is trivial, but going to the moon is hard. But I think he probably misunderstood that you were saying you need both sides of the coin to be able to go to the moon. So he perhaps thought you were on the attack rather than saying there's another side that needs to go hand in hand with the excellent improvements that Neuralink has made. Is that fair?
So I regret that I think my comments were probably not very well phrased. The demonstration was on quite late on a Friday night in Britain. I may have had a glass of whiskey whilst watching it, and I do regret somewhat the way that I described what he's doing.
Yeah.
However, I think that under different circumstances, Elon and I would love to sit down with him and talk about what he's doing, because I understand how at least some of how difficult it is to do what he's trying to do. I mean, I have for many years struggled with sometimes uncooperative animals who don't want to come out on cue when there are people in the lab to see the demonstration.
Yeah.
I have struggled with the difficulties of recording signals from the brain, possibly also, struggling with somewhat less financial resources to throw at the problem than Elon has. But I understand entirely the difficulty and the importance of the engineering efforts to improve these technologies. I think that he and I, like I say, under different circumstances, could probably have quite an interesting discussion about the other side of the coin, which is what are the neuroscience challenges. Because I'm sure, he's a smart guy, and he's also got some very smart guys working on the team. So I am sure that they are thinking through all of the kind of questions that I'm raising, and I don't think that this is news to him.
Yeah. He said much sharper things, shall we say, to other people as well. So I don't think you're I don't think you're the only person who's taken a little bit of a tongue lashing from Elon Musk.
I should also say that I don't really engage in social media very much. I'm a little bit old-fashioned in that regard, and it was interesting to discover on as I woke up on a Saturday morning that I'd sort of accidentally ended up in a kind of Twitter war when I don't actually use Twitter myself. So I probably need to learn how these platforms work and be a little bit more measured with what I say.
You're not missing out on much, Professor Jackson. Trust me, you're not missing out on much. Stay out. I wish I had. So one of the things you were saying is that this presentation, as we said, it didn't focus too much on the science, it was more on the engineering side. There wasn't a lot said about how we're going to decode this brain data that's coming out. Also, another claim that Elon Musk made was this idea of enhancing brain functions or reading and writing memories.
Another question from Twitter. Will you be able to save and replay memories in the future?
Yes, I think in the future you'll be able to save and replay memories. I mean, this is obviously sounding increasingly like a Black Mirror episode, but well, I guess they're pretty good at predicting. But yeah, essentially, if you have a whole brain interface, everything that's encoded in memory, you could upload. You could basically store your memories as a backup and restore the memories. And ultimately, you could potentially download them into a new body or into a robot body. The future is going to be weird.
So that seemed a very fanciful thing. So we can read out some of this information from the brain, but can we write things back? That I haven't heard anything about that, and I can't find anything about that from my research.
So there are some really interesting, a few really interesting studies that have started to try and attempt this. So there's a group, I think it was MIT, and they performed a study in mice, I think, that they called the Inception experiment after the movie. Yeah. And they certainly claimed that they had implanted a memory into a mouse. Now, of course, the devil is in the detail. You have to kind of look at sort of what was that memory, how do they know they implanted it, and effectively what they did was they worked out what brain cells were active when the mouse was in a certain area of its enclosure, and they worked out what brain cells were active when the mouse got an electric shock. And roughly speaking, what they did was they used a kind of brain interface technology to activate those neurons together. So the mouse sort of had this idea that he'd been in this bit of the room and suffered an electric shock. Yeah. And then their proof that the mouse now had this memory was that the mouse didn't like the idea of then going over to the corner of that room because he thought he'd get another electric shock. So that, again, is the kind of proof of principle demonstration. Yeah. The problem, again, is that how do you really translate that to some kind of useful sort of memory augmentation? Everything that has been demonstrated to date has been at a very simple level. Those kinds of simple things can, at least in the case of movement, say, produce benefits to people whose normally functioning movement has been impaired in some way. Yeah. But when we want to enhance sort of brain function, we have to at least get up to the level of normal brain function before we can sort of think about using something. And again, in terms of kind of moving a computer cursor on a screen, you are going to be way better at the moment moving that cursor around using your mouse than you will ever, your computer mouse, obviously, than you will if you try and use at the moment the state-of-the-art brain-machine interface. Again, with vision, yes, if you're blind, something that stimulates your visual cortex may give you something that's better than no vision at all, but it's not going to come sort of close to the acuity of a normally functioning visual system. And I think this gets even more true when we come to things that we understand much less, like memories and so forth. So that's where I think that we need to some extent separate out the reality of what's been demonstrated to date versus the kind of the hype or the showmanship, the bold claims.
So a lot of that is probably the sort of the Tesla, SpaceX sort of showmanship of of Elon Musk and making quite bold claims when really they're a long way off. They're a long way down the track. I mean, he's got a little bit of previous for this, hasn't he? He said that Tesla would be able to self-drive across the US, I think, by this year. That we'd have 1 million robo-taxis on the roads by this year, and it hasn't happened. But it's good to see people pouring money into this and thinking big, but we also have to constrain as you say, the hype and the to the reality of what actually might be achievable. It's important to do that.
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, yes. I mean, it's very easy to say that something can't be done or something won't work, and plenty of people were saying that electric cars were a kind of non-starter, and you have to sort of acknowledge that Elon Musk and others have really changed the face of what we think of as possible in these areas. Not everything will come along exactly on timetable, and not all of these great kind of ideas will be realized, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. And I certainly don't want to come across as someone who's sort of sitting on the sidelines saying don't do it. And for one thing, like I say, I think the technology that he's developing will be very useful for pushing research forward, even if none of the applications that he wants to see come out of this. There will undoubtedly be applications that I want to see come out of this. At the same time, this is kind of bringing the field to a new generation of people who may be kind of learning about neuroscience and are going to be inspired to find out more about it, contribute, become the next generation of neuroscientists to take this further. And then the other thing I think that we have really, so this again is I don't know, maybe a controversial view, but I'll sort of say it. I think one problem we have is at the moment all of this technology is being developed by scientists and engineers, and we all value kind of intelligence, and we all value sort of being smart and remembering things and that kind of thing. And I think so when we think about the functions that this technology could have, we immediately start thinking, oh, this technology is going to make us smarter, or it's going to make our memories better, or it's going to allow us to download information from the internet into our heads. I think one problem we have is we haven't really figured out the right applications to try and sort of pitch this technology on, because without wishing to seem like a kind of snobbish academic, I don't think that the intellectual enhancement is necessarily what the general public is after, or what people are looking for. Technology, we still don't really kind of always push that technology as hard as we can. And I think I sort of liken it slightly to the internet, right? In that the internet again was a technology that was invented by scientists. And we thought it was great because it was a way of sharing academic papers. We could send each other sort of the results of experiments. And the internet went along for some years without anyone else outside of academia paying any attention to it at all. And it only really took off when someone else discovered that you could send, other stuff to each other. And it sort of found a use that was completely different from the one that the academics had imagined using it for. And I think brain-machine interfaces might be the same, right? It might turn out that actually this technology does not have an application to make us all smarter or merge our minds with artificial intelligence or all the things that Elon wants to do, because I'm not sure that's what the man in the street is really looking for. But for example, if you could use this technology, I mean, it's just sort of some sensible things, right? So if you could use some of this technology, say to tackle kind of obesity or something like that, then I think you have something that you really might be thinking that you could kind of take to a wider market.
Yes, I was going to say, you maybe just touched on how difficult it is to know what the applications will be in 10, 15 years, because we don't know what we'll want to do when we get these when we get the science off the ground. But where do you see this field going in the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years? What applications are on the horizon? Is it prostheses? Is it controlling things with our mind? Is it these super enhanced humans? It doesn't seem like it is, but what do you see as being the applications in the next sort of on the horizon?
So I think that there are clear applications in treating disabilities. We talked about spinal cord injury, paralysis, blindness. I think that there are, we haven't really talked about deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease, but there are epilepsy, but there are very clear kind of neurological conditions that I think neurotechnology will increasingly have a role in potential treatments, alongside all the kind of other treatments that are being developed, stem cells, regenerative medicine. It will become another tool in the armory for fighting neurological diseases. People, I think that it's going to be a while before we elect to have invasive. There are other brain-machine interface technologies that are based on kind of non-invasive technologies, things that can go on the skull. They are already finding kind of limited applications in things like gaming and even things like monitoring that someone who's driving a lorry long distance isn't going to fall asleep at the wheel. I can imagine applications there. When it comes to the implants, though, I mean, I often used to get, I would get asked by people, you know, can you really imagine anyone would want to have a surgical implant into their brain? And this is sort of where I get to. So I now respond by saying that, well, actually, a lot of people do elect to have invasive surgeries and invasive implants into their body to enhance function, right? And I'm thinking of things like breast augmentation, right? And no one thinks, oh, well, and people do, but a lot of people don't think, oh, this is kind of shocking that one would go into surgery and have a surgeon implant something in your body.
Because we've normalized it in our society, haven't we? So it's the same could happen.
But also because it's an application that people want, right? It's an application to make them more attractive. So I really think, you know, I'm speaking slightly sort of foolishly, but I think that the real key that Elon needs to think is, how is he going to use his technology to make someone more attractive, or make someone more popular on social media, or make some because I think then people will start queuing up to use it. But to be honest, to just use this thing to summon my Tesla by thinking rather than getting out my mobile phone to do it, I'm not going to be at the front of the queue for that brain surgery, I'm afraid.
Professor Jackson, thank you so much for going through all that with us. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I've learned a lot. I understand this field a lot better. Where can people go to find out more about your work, what you're doing, and your thoughts about various issues in neuroscience?
What I'd suggest they do is they look at the website of our project CanDo, and the website there is www.cando.ac.uk. We also someone else on the project tweets actively on the project behalf. So look for the CanDo Twitter. As I said to you earlier, I don't really understand Twitter, and I probably need to stay off it.
I'll put all the links down below. Don't worry. So
it's CanDo NCL, I believe, is our Twitter feed. So please have a look at that, and that'll let you know what I'm up to.
I'll put all the links down below, so you don't have to get your hands dirty. I'll do that for you. Everyone, please head over there, find out more, because this has been a really fascinating discussion. You talked about getting the next generation of neuroscientists on board and people interested in this area. I'm very interested in going out and finding more and reading more, and that's only been increased by having this conversation. So again, Professor Jackson, thank you so much for taking the time. I very, very much appreciate it, and hope to get you back when the next application or the next interesting thing in this field comes down the pipe.
Absolutely. Nice talking to you, Sam.
Absolute pleasure, Professor Jackson. Have a lovely evening, and I'll talk to you again soon.